people like me. You need people like me so you can point your fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news. Ow!
Okay, we'll start with this. On the heels of her latest successful title defense, unified minimum weight champion Senicia Estrada says, I was at 40%. Weight cut was not the easiest. Senicia has successfully campaigned in 3 divisions, been a champion in 2, minimum weight being the lowest she's ever gone down. I made it tougher than it should have been just because physically I felt like at 40%, Estrada said on the 3 knockdown rule with Steve Kim and Mario Lopez. My weight cut was not the easiest. I just felt dehydrated before and after the weigh-in and during the fight, so my body wouldn't allow me to do certain things that I should have done. Estrada credited her ability to adjust on the fly despite the physical distress for leading her to the victory over Yudica, a former flyweight titleist. Yeah, one thing about my style is that I can adjust very quickly, and I have a great trainer who told me what adjustments to make, and I was able to make those adjustments, she said. I mean, there aren't too many fighters who can make adjustments in the middle of a fight and towards the end of it. Few interesting tidbits about the fight is that Leonela Paula Yudica took Senicia's power better than I expected. Now, could that be an indicator of what Senicia is talking about? Because 2 things can be true at the same time. That Leonela took Senicia's power better than I expected, took the punches well, and was able to weather them because Senicia was feeling under the weather, less than 100%. Punches weren't cracking the way they normally crack. I mean, there aren't too many fighters who can make adjustments in the middle of the fight and towards the end of a fight. I'm just grateful that with my style, I'm able to make adjustments. And she did. She finished strong. Estrada admitted it was a mistake skimping out on using her dietitian, the nutrition team perfecting athletes for the entire duration of her camp, and promised to utilize them more fully in her next outing. The Florida-based company has a long track record of working with world-class athletes. The weight has never been an issue for me, which is why I thought it would be easy this time, Estrada said. My last fight for my WBC and WBA titles, I used my perfecting athletes nutritionists, so everything was smooth, everything was great. I used them this time, but I just didn't have them as involved, and I didn't have them there fight week, so I just started my weight cut a little too late. First time I ever experienced feeling dehydrated. Talking very slow, kind of slurring my words. I tried my best not to show it during the fighter meetings and fight day as well. I still felt that way. I've been watching Senicia Estrada consistently over the years, and I have to say that that's the hardest I've seen her have to work for the victory. It was inconsistent with what I'm accustomed to seeing from her. So when she says that she's feeling under the weather, or was, I don't think she's making excuses. Hey, you live and you learn, and next camp, I'm gonna make sure I have perfecting athletes with me throughout the whole camp, throughout the whole fight week, and make the weight cut easier. Estrada could be headed for a unification fight with WBO and IBF minimum weight champion Yo Costavalle of Costa Rica, who greeted Estrada in the ring Saturday night after her win over Yudica. I'm still not confident that the fight happens. I mean, I'm not optimistic because there are promotional issues, platform issues. Yo Costavalle very recently had a meeting with Golden Boy Promotions. It seems she's still affiliated with them. Reflecting on Senicia's performance with Leonela Paula Yudica, you are talking about a fighter in Leonela Paula Yudica, a former champion who normally campaigns 2 divisions north of minimum weight, where their contest took place. So, between Leonela Paula Yudica's durability, the durability often associated with Argentinian fighters as well, they're very tough. She dropped down 2 divisions for this fight, and she was still able to take Senicia Estrada's punches well. Could that be because of what Senicia is saying? That she had a rough weight cut and she wasn't herself. She was a bit weaker than she usually is. I can believe that, but I can also believe that Leonela Paula Yudica being somewhat taller than Senicia Estrada, noticeably taller actually, and longer, Senicia misjudged the distance.
On her way out, on her way in.
No, perhaps that's because she's fighting a taller, longer fighter than she's used to fighting. A counter-puncher, an outside fighter, essentially.
Outboxer.
Senicia being the shorter fighter of the two with the lower center of gravity, front foot heavy, coming forward, that does expose her to punches. More punches than if she were moving lateral, moving away from the action. She was moving towards
It
it.
was a rough performance.
Much harder than I expected it to be for Senicia, and I had her winning the fight. I mean, I think the right woman won the fight, but the judges had it by a wider margin than I did.
So some part of the performance and how difficult it was could be that Senicia had a rough weight cut.
Yet another part is the stylistic matchup, that she was fighting a taller, longer fighter that just so happens to be a counter-puncher.
Senicia misjudged the distance at times, thinking she was out of striking distance when she wasn't.
She got caught coming in a couple of times with some good counter hooks.
Yeah.
So, two things can be true at the same time. Though if Senicia Estrada is to continue campaigning as a minimum weight, she better keep perfecting athletes on deck.
Can't afford too many performances like that.
Men's heavyweight news, I'm sure most of you have heard by now that Anthony Joshua is back on the hunt for an opponent as Dillian Whyte is pulled from next week's heavyweight showdown due to adverse findings in his VADA tests.
After one of the most exhilarating weeks the sport of boxing has ever seen, we're back in the shit, back to the scandals.
A recent drug test result has officially knocked out the Anthony Joshua versus Dillian Whyte rematch. Matchroom Boxing announced Saturday morning that Whyte was removed from the heavyweight sequel after a random drug test as contracted through VADA,
The Voluntary Anti-Doping Association.
turned adverse analytical findings as part of random anti-doping protocols. In light of this news, the fight will be canceled and a full investigation will be conducted. This is what, the second or third time Dillian Whyte has popped hot?
I don't put anything past anyone at this point. I mean, Jarrell Miller tested positive 2 times.
3, if you count his positive finding as a kickboxer and the 2 he had as a pro boxer. I mean, Dillian Whyte, Jarrell Miller,
Alexander Povetkin.
Luis Ortiz, Bermain Stavern. It's tell-them age at this point. It's par for the course.
It happens, and it happens all the time.
Though seemingly at the most inopportune times when we're talking about Matchroom. I mean, it always seems to happen right before the fight.
Without much time left to salvage the show, to find a replacement, and that's curious.
The substance in question was not identified as this goes to publication. Representatives from VADA, Matchroom, and the BBBOC did not immediately respond to a boxing scene inquiry seeking further clarification. The rematch was due to headline an August 12th event from the O2 Arena in London, which also hosted their December 2015 meeting, won by Joshua via 7th round knockout.
I don't got the stomach for this stuff.
The event is still scheduled to move forward with its remaining undercard bouts still intact, per Chris McKenna of the Daily Star. Joshua's team has already begun the process to hopefully secure a replacement opponent to remain on the show.
Shades of the Jarrell Miller fiasco years ago. You will recall that when Jarrell Miller was pulled, it was because he tested positive for a number of banned substances, and Andy Ruiz ended up standing in as a result. We all know what happened.
Thus, Anthony Joshua and his team have to tread carefully here. You don't just pick anybody, you learn from your mistakes. Now, both Anthony and Dillian were coming off of separate 12-round wins over Jermaine Franklin in their most recent outings. Whyte barely outpointed the American heavyweight in a majority decision victory last November at the OVO Arena at Wembley. Joshua scored a more convincing win over Franklin April 1st of this year, though in a relatively dull affair. Joshua still has the chance to build on that momentum after back-to-back defeats to Alexander Usyk, the first fight which ended his second unified heavyweight title reign.
The future is far grimmer for Dillian Whyte.
Now, I'll be honest with you. I was looking forward to this fight. I was. But I'm not that broken up that it's canceled. I mean, I would have actually preferred to see Anthony fight someone else.
I wasn't over the moon over this rematch.
Comes to Dillian Whyte. The former heavyweight title challenger has twice before tested positive for a banned substance. A testing sample collected surrounding his October 2012 knockout win over Sandor Baldo produced findings of the banned substance. I can't pronounce that.
Call it MHA.
An investigation by the National Anti-Doping Panel acknowledged that it was consumed through an over-the-counter purchase of banned supplement Jack, but issued a 2-year suspension for failure to seek professional or medical advice.
It was the first time. The second time, it was ahead of the Oscar Rivas fight.
WBC interim title fight to crown Deontay Wilder's mandatory challenger. Deontay Wilder, the WBC champion at that time. That was the second time that Dillian Whyte pissed hot, banned substance found in his system, and this is the third. I mean, at this point, it's not an isolated incident.
No.
It looks more like pattern behavior.
Same way it looked like pattern behavior for Jarrell Miller, who tested positive 3 times across 2 combat sports, 2 different disciplines. The same way it looked like pattern behavior for him is the same way it looks like pattern behavior for Dillian.
Though with the sport of boxing being rife with doping issues, fighters that are using banned substances behind closed doors, you start to ask yourself, is it really who's using banned substances, or is it who isn't? Just think about how many fighters have tested positive for a banned substance in the last 5 or 6 years. Dillian Whyte, Jarrell Miller, Lucas Brown, Luis Ortiz,
Alexander Povetkin.
Not only did those guys all test positive for a banned substance, they tested positive more than once. And you have Tyson Fury and Canelo Alvarez, Oscar Valdez, Zolani Tete, Jean Pascal, Alberto Puello, Michelle Rivera, Conor Benn. The list goes on. It seems like every other month, not just any boxer, but a high-profile boxer, a high-profile fighter, is testing positive for a banned substance, to where you start to ask yourself, maybe the whole goddamn sport is dirty. And it's not a question of who's using, it's a question of who isn't.
Now, as you can imagine, Dillian Whyte has already professed his innocence with a public statement.
I am shocked and devastated to learn of a report by VADA of an adverse finding relating to me. I only learned of it this morning, and I am still reacting to it. I have also just seen that the fight is being cancelled without having any chances to demonstrate my innocence before the decision was taken. I can confirm without a shadow of a doubt that I have not taken the reported substance, the substance which has not yet been identified, not publicly.
Not to us.
Dillian says he can confirm without a shadow of a doubt that he has not taken the reported substance in this camp or at any point in his life. I am completely innocent and ask to be given the time to go through the process of proving this without anybody jumping to conclusions or a trial by media.
Though without the substance itself being made public to the boxing community at large, the boxing community is still going to jump to their own conclusions. They always do.
And when it's your third rodeo, not your first, your innocence gets that much harder to proclaim, that much harder for the boxing community to believe. Dillian continued, I insisted on 24/7 VADA testing for this fight, as I have done voluntarily and at my own expense for all of my fights for many, many years. This is not the first time that I have been reported as having an adverse finding for a substance which I have not taken. And as I did the last time, I will again prove that I am completely innocent. In the meantime, all I can do is express my extreme disappointment to boxing fans who will miss out on what was sure to be a great event.
It all sounds good, but it all sounds familiar.
Same way this isn't Dillian Whyte's first rodeo. It's not the boxing community's first rodeo either. How many of these guys actually cop to the rap?
How many of these guys that test positive for a banned substance come out and say, all right, you got me. You caught me red-handed.
This is all too familiar.
And the race has begun to find Anthony Joshua a late replacement, someone to stand in for Dillian Whyte. Former unified champion Andy Ruiz stated,
We need that trilogy, and he tagged Eddie Hearn. In truth, if Anthony Joshua and the people at Matchroom had decided to stage a trilogy with Andy Ruiz instead of a rematch with Dillian Whyte, I actually would have been more receptive to that, because when you think about how Andy won the first fight and how Anthony won the second, that actually does leave room for a third. When Andy beat Anthony Joshua, he left no doubts, but when Anthony beat him,
he didn't either. It was a lopsided affair.
So if Andy Ruiz is supposed to be fighting Deontay Wilder for what would be WBC interim status, why is he so willingly throwing his name into the hat for a Joshua fight? You have to make it make sense. And he's not alone. American up-and-comer Michael Hunter,
he told Andy, nah, bro, sit this one out.
in effect, throwing his name into the hat. I think it says a lot about Anthony Joshua's drawing power that as soon as he's in the market for an opponent, a long line of opponents,
Potential opponents.
a laundry list of guys, shows up out of nowhere. Andy Ruiz, Michael Hunter, I saw Otto Valin throw throwing his name into the hat, some desire expressed by the boxing community at large to see Anthony take on Croatia's own Filip Hrgovic, the IBF's mandatory challenger, who was set to be making an appearance on that same show, that same card. In truth, I feel like if Anthony's going to end up fighting somebody, it'll be somebody that was already booked for the show.
Not Andy.
Even though I do think there's a precedence, an actual precedence for a third fight, a rubber match, but not Andy. That's not the kind of guy you fight on short notice. Not necessarily Michael Hunter, and not Otto Wallin either. It's going to be somebody, I think it's going to be somebody that was already booked to fight on that same card.
But they still have to tread carefully. Don't forget that the focus is getting Anthony to that Deontay Wilder showdown later on this year or early next year.
There were 4 potential names on that same show who perhaps may end up standing in for Dillian Whyte. Now, one is Filip Hrgovic, who I just mentioned, and the man he's supposed to fight, Australia's own unbeaten up-and-comer, a southpaw, Dempsey McKean.
There's those two.
And then there is Del Boy Derek Chisora, and the man that he's supposed to fight, America's own Gallo Negro, Gerald Washington, who would serve as a common opponent between Anthony and Deontay Wilder, who he's supposed to be fighting either later on this year or early next year. Out of those 4 names, what you then have to do is put your thinking cap on. Who's available? Who makes sense?
It doesn't make sense to take on an Olympian on short notice. Being honest with you, if the focus is getting to a Wilder fight later on, a few months from now, it doesn't make sense to jeopardize that fighting an Olympian on only a week's notice. So that rules out Filip Hrgovic, at least for me.
I mean, I don't know that he will pick him. I don't know that he won't. Though if he does, it's a ballsy choice. It's a dicey situation. Hrgovic doesn't seem likely, but then again, neither does Dempsey McKean. Dempsey is a statuesque southpaw.
They were getting ready to fight an orthodox fighter in Dillian Whyte. Not a statuesque southpaw, not a long and limber guy like Dempsey McKean.
So I don't know how likely they are to pull a stand-in out of those 2 guys, out of Filip Hrgovic and Dempsey McKean. Sam Jones recommended that they give Derek Chisora the opportunity. Derek Chisora, who's coming right off that loss to Tyson Fury late last year. I think that Derek would be a more sensible choice than either Filip Hrgovic or Dempsey McKean, though not as intriguing. Del Boy is a fan favorite, though, isn't he?
Remember that the focus is making it to the Wilder fight. Do you really want to jeopardize that with either unbeaten Dempsey McKean or unbeaten Filip Hrgovic?
Derek Chisora's getting long in the tooth. He's coming off a loss, and he's seen a lot of winners. Derek Chisora seems a more likely choice to me than either of those 2 guys, or the man he's supposed to fight, America's own Gerald Washington, who would service as a common opponent between Anthony and Deontay, and a cheaper alternative, I think, to Derek Chisora, because Derek drives a hard bargain.
He'll fight in the main event, but he's going to want extra money to do it.
Do you remember all the hell he raised when he was fighting David Price on the undercard of Josh Taylor versus Regis Prograis? He wanted extra money.
He's going to want extra money for this.
Thus, a cheaper alternative to Derek, and a guy who's available, is the guy that Derek is fighting, Gallo Negro, Gerald Washington.
We'll see what happens.